All right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, or good evening. So we're here for a session called All Things About Research Data and Findings. The original lineup has changed just slightly today. So today we've got George Bridgewater from Animal Ask. He's the head of research there. And we've got Joe Anderson from Faunalytics, who is the research director. Obviously, research is incredibly important to any advocacy work so that we can kind of know we're on track, know we're campaigning about the correct things, and we're going to run effective campaigns. We're going to share accurate information. We can understand our audiences and the people that our campaigns are going to reach. Communicating effectively is obviously very important. So to start out today, we're going to go with George. George, would you like to share your screen?
Sure. Is that all working okay?
Looks good. Yes.
Cool.
Before you begin, let me just say to anybody in the audience here, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat or to the Q&A section, and we'll go ahead and pull those together for the Q&A session at the end, and that goes for during both presentations. Thanks. Go ahead, George.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks, Brooke. Right. Yeah. Today I'm going to talk a bit about campaign prioritization. As prioritization, which includes any kind of projects you're considering, which is both campaigns or interventions, kind of what the research can look like to identify the kind of most impactful things we can be working on. So yeah, I wanted to start with a question of how do we currently decide what projects we work on? I mean, perhaps they're somewhat reactive in a piece of secondary legislation comes up for review, and it is like a particularly time-sensitive opportunity to advocate for an animal. Perhaps they're partially influenced by funders. A lot of funders are interested in things like cage-free, and they'll provide funding for that sort of work, and they've kind of already decided on the kind of perceived value of that, and it can be led partially by that. Or perhaps it's your own internal staff's personal perception on the value of the campaigns. But there are many different elements we can involve in this decision, from kind of what species to work on, kind of what the animal welfare impacts of a particular improvement, if it's kind of secondary legislation or kind of corporate work, both the intensity of suffering or the kind of duration, and both kind of from a direct suffering perspective as well as kind of behavioral frustration. Other factors to consider are kind of what other groups are working on in the region, what's already kind of being covered by another group if we think they're particularly likely to succeed without our assistance, or what other groups could we kind of work with to campaign and provide additional pressure on an issue if it's very important, but might not otherwise pass without additional help. And finally, and importantly, is understanding the existing conditions of animals in the region, both kind of on-farm conditions for animals or for issues that affect other animals, kind of what that actually looks like in practice for them. What are the kind of the main causes of mortality or injury? What are the main sources of behavioral frustration? It's important to get kind of a practical understanding of kind of what's actually going on farm for farm animals. Cool. So from what we found from our research and what others have found in this area as well, is that the variation in impact between different asks, campaigns, or interventions is very significant. I think broadly from our research, we found this can vary many orders of magnitude, tens or hundreds of times, depending on the policy. Particularly in policy and legislative campaigns, the routes for impacts are so different, from kind of working on taxation and subsidization to kind of direct requirements. The variation in how in effect these different policy tools can have is just very significant. Fortunately, a lot of groups are already doing somewhat of a good job prioritizing different asks. So this variation is reduced compared to what it is kind of naturally amongst all ideas. But we still found there's like a wide variation in the value of different campaigns that groups decide to work on. And for our movement survey, we found was something that a lot of our respondents agreed, saying that they perceived that the research to prioritize optimal farm animal advocacy asks was neglected within the movement. But I wanted to speak a bit briefly about why this is such a difficult problem, why kind of campaign selection and identifying the top opportunities is kind of a difficult thing to do with less research, or even with research where it's difficult. So yeah, what campaigns we work on, we kind of select the ideas that we think have the highest perceived value. And this is in part because of the true value of the campaign. So if we had an objective look into the future and we could see what effect the campaign would have, that's in part what is affecting our perceived value. But it also comes from kind of an error in our perception. Maybe we miss a flow-through effect a policy or a corporate government policy might have. Maybe we don't see a particular flaw in the theory of change. Like maybe there's a step in the path from impact, the kind of story of impact we have that this policy might have. And there's a flaw there that we don't perceive initially. So the campaigns that look particularly high value to us do in part because of this kind of true value, and in part because of this random error in our perception. And this problem becomes particularly more of an issue as we have more alternatives available to us, as demonstrated in this graph. So as the number of alternatives increase, the chance that an idea has done, say, 3 times, it looks 3 times better than it actually is when it's implemented to us, becomes more likely. Because any given idea maybe has like a few % chance that will happen. But as you get more and more ideas, the odds that a campaign is doing particularly well because of error is much more likely. You can think of this as if we had 3 ideas, the odds that one is we've been wildly off on any given one is quite low. But if you had 100 ideas, then the likelihood that one of them is off by many orders of magnitude is actually, it becomes quite high. And what this means is that when we're prioritizing the kind of top interventions, it means that the ideas that we're selecting are disproportionately more likely to have optimistic estimates rather than pessimistic estimates. So the things that we think of as top priority kind of make sense. We're almost more, the things that are looking good on perceived value are very much more likely to have kind of that value because we've been kind of overly optimistic rather than being pessimistic. Because if we've been pessimistic on their value, they would be probably somewhere further down in our priorities. This means that after we select a campaign or intervention, we should expect to be disappointed in the true value of the campaign because we've overestimated it. We're being kind of overly optimistic. This issue is known as the optimizer's curse, and I encourage people to kind of have a look into this a bit more. But broadly, what this means is that on average, poorly researched promising ideas are likely to have much less value than we expect, and even less value than many of the ideas that we may have discounted because we've been overly pessimistic, or we've just seen much more rigorous existing research, which has a more realistic expectation of the value that might have. And this effect is in proportion to the level of uncertainty or the standard deviation in our estimate of their expected value. So this means campaigns where we're more uncertain will regress more upon further analysis, suggesting that kind of researching all ideas with equal rigor is important so that we're not kind of being accidentally biased against some ideas by seeing their true value and comparing that against an idea where we have this kind of perceived optimistic assessment. Yeah, there are a few ways to get around this issue. One is what we do, but which I suggest researching all the interventions or campaigns you could work on in much more depth. You want to get kind of a realistic assessment of the value these will have. And that's something you can only get under kind of sufficient analysis. The other is by adjusting for uncertainty when you're considering different campaign options. So even if you evaluate everything with equal rigor, some campaigns are just going to be much more uncertain. Maybe it's like a new policy idea, or it's only been implemented in a couple of countries before, so you don't have many case studies of what the policy might look like. Or maybe there's if it's animal welfare improvement on kind of an animal that's just kind of under-researched in existing animal welfare science, your certainty on what is the most important thing for them to improve might just be much lower. And in those cases, even with a lot of background research, that just might not be the information there already, we then suggest discounting the expected effect of those campaigns quite significantly, because we're just not certain in their effects, and it's much more likely that they're doing well because of error. And this means we should adjust to kind of our prior perception of campaigns and kind of adjust downwards to go for like slightly more evidence-based campaigns. Cool. So yeah, what does this look like in practice? So yeah, for an organization that we typically work with, they'll come to us with a grant for expanding the work. Maybe they've got an opportunity to run a new campaign. they'll have a short list of a few ideas that they've considered, but this is kind of, they're more in the ideation phase. They've heard that this is a good thing to work on, or they've seen these two different ad campaigns and are kind of quite excited by the work. We'll then support the organization with in-depth cross-comparative research on all the possible opportunities, as well as kind of providing them with additional ideas. We've got a long list of different policy options, or if it's for a particular animal, we'll run through all the kind of major welfare issues for that animal, all the different stages in their life, all the different improvements. So we'll kind of, generally we'll expand the short list of their ideas kind of quite significantly. If it's 3, it could be many orders of magnitude, but if they've got their own initial short list, we'll kind of usually end up doubling the number of ideas that they should be considering. The typical outcome we have our research is, without our support, the organization would have gone for one of the kind of initial shortlisted ideas. And after our research, a few of those will regress. Occasionally, one of those ideas does end up being one of the top ideas, and that's always very fortunate. Yeah, usually a couple of ideas will regress, potentially even some will end up as negative, rarely, the case with the meat tax. Yeah, after our extensive research, we'll kind of identify a couple of opportunities for them to advocate for animals in their region. So yeah, I'll broadly go through our process briefly. I'm also happy to talk to people about this afterwards if they're interested in either running this themselves. Yeah, we'll start out with kind of country scoping. I think with all these intervention or campaign selection, it's important to have a good understanding of the context you're working in, both in terms of kind of cultural factors or kind of barriers to advocacy. Maybe you can't run large-scale protests, so that just isn't an option for you. As well as kind of getting a detailed understanding of either the corporate supply chain that you're working in and the kind of power structure within that, which actors have the most ability to influence their supply chains, what steps in there are involved for kind of most animals or the most significant life stages. And then for legislation, kind of going through kind of detailed legislation, getting an understanding of what are the existing requirements, how do those fit together, how does this, what's the interaction between primary and secondary legislation, and kind of what opportunities we have to change. Another thing to look out for at this stage as well is also to look out for regulatory capture. So if you are looking through legislation in your country and the methods for legislative change in your country, you might see that kind of farmers or industry players have like undue influence over the laws that are getting created. And there are some kind of policy options to kind of reduce that. I'll just go through quickly the typical research methodology we use, and we suggest other groups use as well, is we will do iterative depth research. I'll get the slides to behave. So yeah, we'll do iterative depth research where we're going to go through multiple research rounds using multiple different research methodologies with multiple different researchers and multiple different classes of evidence. And the idea of this, referring back to the optimizer's curse, the problem with high uncertainty campaigns kind of tending to regress, is that if you use any individual method of assessment, the chance that an error on that increases your perception of their value is actually reasonably high, particularly in the earlier rounds, in kind of shallower research. So instead, we use multiple different decision-making methodologies and multiple different researchers doing independent assessments. And the theory behind this is that when we use these multiple different methodologies, multiple different researchers, the chance that an error occurs across all of these methodologies simultaneously to give us an overly optimistic or overly pessimistic perception of a campaign's value is much less likely. So yes, we'll begin with like a quick, short investigation of a lot of ideas. A lot of ideas are like very clearly, or campaigns or interventions can look very clearly like not a priority. And we'll cut these out earlier to save time and kind of reduce the cost of the research. And then we'll do iterative depth of like an additional round at moderate depth with the same research methodologies. And then finally, we'll move on to writing extensive reports, which can be seen on our website. It's a few examples. This all culminates in an ask in one or two or a few recommendations for a region of what might be the highest impact things for groups to work on. And this will be robust to, it'll be more robust to uncertainty given the extensive research that has gone into them and the kind of multiple different factors that have been considered. So a quick case study of a group we've worked with. It was Sentence Politics. yeah, we worked with them in Switzerland. They were looking to do a legislative campaign, either doing motions or ballot initiatives. Motions are kind of private members bill-esque, if you're familiar with those in your context. So a member of Parliament can kind of put forward a motion for legislation. They had no initial draft for ideas, and we kind of drew up an ideas list with them, looking at what would fit into their typical organizational scope, what looks particularly tractable for them. And then after our our extensive research, we provided them with recommendations, which they now plan to pursue for several motions, showing that some of the ideas they would be unlikely to come up with. A few stats on our work previously. Yeah, the most important one being the kind of percentage more effective we found we can make campaigns. So yeah, we found on average we can increase the value of campaigns by 25%. This includes some organizations that kind of already fortunately had the best idea in their top 3. So yeah, the counterfactuals will be a bit poorer. But yeah, a lot of the time on average we're finding we can increase the value of groups campaigns quite significantly. Yeah, finally, there's a lot of other research on our website from kind of intervention reports on kind of text investment. CCTV was a recent one that was published, CCTV in slaughterhouses, as well as some other kind of consultation style research we've done for groups, including kind of costing welfare improvements to kind of support their advocacy in knowing that they're not, when they're speaking with industry, they're not asking for something that's exorbitantly expensive, as well as a variety of other reports. Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. I'll pass on to Joe, I believe is next.
Yes, thank you very much, George. That was really interesting. And I'm sure there will be questions afterwards.
Cool. Thank you, Brett.
Reminder to anybody listening that you can add questions into the Q&A or into the chat, and we're compiling everything for afterwards. Joe, are you ready to begin?
Sure, I will just share my screen.
Perfect.
Go back. Sorry, I was trying to make the little Zoom bar go away, which it is now done. Thank you everyone for having me. It's nice to be speaking to you all today, dark and early from Ottawa in Canada. I'm going to talk today about doing your own research. So this is for groups who want to undertake some sort of research of their own to better understand their audience, or to look into the numbers of animals affected by various situations, really anything along those lines where you just want to try and conduct some research of your own. And this is going to be a relatively high-level presentation on this topic, just because it is so possible to go into a lot of depth in any number of different ways. But I really encourage you, if any of these appeal to you or are something that you're considering, to talk to people at Faunalytics or elsewhere. We offer pro bono office hours to chat about research ideas or any help that you might need, because there really are a lot of different ways that you can take this and a lot of things to learn. So first, just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. There are 2 main sections to this presentation. The first is about getting started with research, where to begin. And then the second is just key basics that apply pretty broadly to a lot of different types of research. And I'll also be talking about some common pitfalls that we see with groups undertaking research for the first time, potentially, but those will be throughout the presentation and highlighted with these stop sign looking graphics. So first, the getting started section, these are the questions that I will be looking at. So framing your research question. This is such an important part of the early research process, and one that people often aren't even aware of. So by this, I mean, you need to start off by defining clearly, preferably in a short phrase, the main thing that you want to know from the research that you're planning on doing. And the second part of this is called operationalization. That's the part where you take what you want to know and say how you're going to try and get that answer. And I will give you an example. But first, the pitfall here like I said, a lot of people aren't even aware of this step, and skipping it can be harmful to your research in a number of different ways. So things that we see from skipping this step can include missing a key question entirely, which might seem surprising, but depending on how complex the issue is that you're interested in, it is possible to accidentally miss something that you're really important to you. It's also very possible to measure something that you're interested in a way that makes it difficult to interpret or work with for your organization. Or taking the kitchen sink approach to research, where whether it's interviews or a survey or something else, you try just throwing everything at the wall in the hopes that you get the information that you need. And sometimes that works, but it can also have a number of problematic effects in terms of, participant burnout or even researcher burnout. So just to give you an example of this whole process, this is the sort of broad objective that a lot of groups will start with. For instance, to understand whether a campaign was worth doing after the fact, or to understand how we could improve the next campaign, both of which are good objectives, but too broad to be considered a research question. So to transform them into what I would consider a good research question, I usually encourage people to really interrogate, to ask yourself a lot of questions about specifically what you mean by each part of your objective. What do you mean by worth doing? What does that mean to your group? Or if you want to improve the next time, what do you mean by improvement? What kind of improvement? And this will give you better, stronger research questions along these lines. Did this campaign that we ran meaningfully change the target audience's behavior, for instance? Or how did the cost per participant compare to other campaigns that we've run? Or are there ways that we could increase reach and participation, particularly in underrepresented segments of the target group? So you'll notice that those are a lot more specific than the original objectives that we had, and they are ones that you could much more easily turn into measurable questions to include in your research. Next question is, of course, what kind of data or research do you need? And this is just going to cover a few of the most common types of research or data that people need, but bearing in mind that it might not fit all cases. So first of all, a lot of the time groups will need information, statistics, like the number of people that are affected by something or the number of animals. In this case, I'm showing an example from Faunalytics, summaries of FAO data about animal slaughter. You might need to know how something works, like production costs in your country, government regulation, or something else. You might want to test an approach. So similar to what George was talking about, but probably at a more specific level, like which of these two ads is better, which of these two tactics that we're considering, you're really wanting to compare them against each other. Or you might be wanting to understand people, your target audience, or others that are important to the type of work that you're doing. And another part of getting started is to always look for what already exists on this topic. And here, the common pitfall that we see, even in ourselves a lot of the time, is forgetting that this step is important or thinking that it doesn't apply to you. It almost always will apply to you. And there's a number of different places that you can look for existing information, including government websites like these, especially for finding statistics on various things. Google Scholar is a great resource for finding a wide range of different types of research and data, better than just a standard Google search. The FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, is an example of an international body that has data that might be useful to you. And shameless plug for Faunalytics here, our library is the biggest collection of curated research that's useful to animal advocates. So I do strongly recommend looking for something relevant in there because we have thousands of articles that have been curated for exactly these purposes. All right, and when you're looking at these types of research, Sorry, I'm not sure if the Zoom thing is covering for everybody. Hopefully that's okay. So yes, you're looking for research that has been conducted by reliable groups, and that could be hard to assess. So I would say first, academics in a journal and most governments will generally be reliable, valid research. These are just rules of thumb, I should say. It will depend, but it's a good starting point. Media sources are generally not great sources of research if they are the original creator of that research. Often they'll report on other research, like by academics, but if they've done it themselves, it'll often be things like a website poll. Nonprofit organizations and for-profit companies are kind of in this, you kind of need to see on a case-by-case basis. And I say that as a representative of a nonprofit organization that does research. Ours is quite reliable, reputable, I would like to say, but it can vary a lot. Research methods is also important to look at. And if you don't have the knowledge to know whether the methods themselves are good, just looking for whether it's described in detail or not is a good indicator of whether the research is something that you should trust. Not being described at all, not a great sign. And if it's behind a paywall or described in really shallow amounts of detail, it's case by case. Finally, in terms of the description of results, you'll often see scientists, we love to hedge. We want to make limitations and caveats on things. And that is deliberate because no single study is ever definitive. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of what you've done. So if you see research that is making really sweeping claims like this proves something definitively, that's probably not as trustworthy as the one that ironically says that it's less certain of its results. And finally, again, with respect to media in particular, if the source that's talking about the research is actually citing other people's research, go look for the original if you can. Next section, I will talk about some basics of conducting research. So choosing a method, it'll depend on what you're looking for. Here are some common methods that people may or may not be familiar with. Desk research means looking for stats on websites, existing research, essentially looking through what's been done in one way or another. A/B testing is another, it's a sort of experiment, but where you only have 2 or maybe 3 messages, campaigns that you're comparing directly against one another. Interviews and focus groups, I imagine you're familiar with, surveys as well. And then experiments involve random assignment of people to one experience or another. And again, as I mentioned, I am going to be relatively shallow in my descriptions of these things with the understanding that if you want more detail on something in particular, you can check the Faunalytics website or other sources to learn more about it. And then the pitfall that we often see at this stage when you're choosing a method is not thinking about the potential difficulties that you could have with analysis and interpretation. So this is my opinion only, but this is my perception of how lay-friendly these different methods are in terms of whether they're approachable for someone who doesn't have in-depth training in research. And the one that might surprise you is surveys, because they're very easy to put together, but it actually is relatively difficult to construct a survey in such a way that the analyses and interpretations that you do from it are actually valid. So it's very easy to think you have a strong survey, but not to see the flaws in it, or to have collected your participants for the survey in a way that renders your results less useful. So for choosing a method, let's refer back to these different types of research that you might want to conduct. And here are some of the different types of options that are probably better for lay people, things that are a little easier to approach with less assistance required. So desk research, again, means checking government websites, searching the net, looking for international bodies, statistics on things, stuff like that. Looking at existing research involves those things, as well as checking Google Scholar, for instance, for keywords related to what you're interested in. Interviews and focus groups for understanding people's behavior. You need to understand that if you're only talking to somewhere between, say, 5 and 40 people in interviews and focus groups, what they tell you is not necessarily going to represent everybody in the population you're interested in, but it'll give you a really good in-depth starting point. And A/B testing, where you try out 2 different campaigns one way or another. An example of this is having 2 different ads on Facebook and looking at how much click-through to your website you get between the 2 is nice and approachable, because you don't need to do any statistical analysis on it to see which of them works better. Now, what you find out of something like that, it could be that the 2 things are relatively equal and one of them happened to do a little better. But the worst case scenario there is that you're choosing one of 2 options that were pretty equal. It's not going to harm your campaign to do that. It just wouldn't necessarily matter which one of them you chose. There are additional ways that you can approach each of these things that are a little more sophisticated and will probably yield stronger results, more reliable, if you approach them in the right way. There's a lot of different things that come into designing a good survey, like I mentioned, from question wording to how you find your participants. And experiments are a whole other ballpark of a lot of different things to consider. So while these are great methods, I strongly advise groups that haven't used them before and aren't trained in research to enlist assistance with them. Which is where we come to learning more and asking for help. So this is going to talk about different resources that Faunalytics offers, because this is a large part of what we do, is try to help advocates who are thinking about conducting their own research. We have a research advice section of our website that includes these things and more. So everything from designing a study, all the different types we've talked about here and some other ones. There is a training guide for if you want to do interviews or focus groups in a scientific way. There's a webinar specifically about surveys. If you decide to undertake that, you'll see that I am more than capable of talking for over an hour about just surveys alone. And there are so many different factors that go into making a good one. Additionally, because we know that this is a lot and it can be tough to feel confident, we offer one-on-one pro bono support where you can come and ask your questions about what you've learned elsewhere on the site and get some support with designing the best type of research for your needs. And we also have a listing of different options, pro bono and paid, for if you're looking for more in-depth support. We offer limited support ourselves, mostly pro bono for a few hours per organization, but we have a list of other options that are available to you if you need that additional help. And regardless of what type of research you're undertaking, there are a few sort of pieces of the scientific method that I think are useful to bear in mind as you approach any of them. So when I say neutral, I don't mean just sitting back and not caring. I really mean critical equally of everything. So it's super important, regardless of the type of research, to bear in mind the opposite of what you think you're going to find. If you think that people participate in your campaign for a certain reason, you need to give equal weight, equal ability for that result to be found as other results. You think that they participate because they like the flyers that you're handing out, but it could also be that they like the personalities of the people involved. So you need to ask questions or look at the data in a way that will let you see either of those responses, not just the one you're expecting to find. Systematic. So this is a huge, huge piece of any scientific process, setting out a step-by-step plan to how you're going to approach your research. And the pitfall that tends to happen if you don't do this is that it's possible to leave out something important. So this could be a plan to collecting data from the types of participants that you want, thinking about all the different groups you want to represent. If you're going to look for existing data, thinking in advance about, okay, we want data from fishes, chickens, cows, pigs, and making sure that you're checking systematically to find data for each of those things and not forgetting anything. And well documented. The pitfall here, thinking you'll remember, this is very much pointed at myself as well as others. It's so easy to think that, oh, this is simple. I'm just doing a couple of things and I will remember later what I did. But it can very quickly get into a web of different decisions that are made along the way. And it's very easy to forget what you've done. So I always recommend just having a document open, and just a quick note on each step that you're taking is enough to refer back to later so that you can describe the process you took for your research and allow others to see that you did have a systematic and neutral approach, for instance. So the key takeaways that I hope you get from this presentation are, first, keeping it as simple as you can. Again, I haven't gotten into a lot of depth about different things, but one thing that I always like to point out is that existing data that is not exactly perfectly what you need is better than new data you collect that you accidentally bias because you didn't put enough thought into neutrality and being systematic. So stick with what already exists if you can. It's also much faster and cheaper. And research is like baking, building, sewing, crafting, or many other things in life. Preparing really well ahead of time will save you time and trouble later. So sort of the measure twice, cut once theory applied to measurement works as well as elsewhere in life. And learning about your chosen method beyond the depth that I have very briefly touched on in this presentation is super important. And just remember that help and resources are available. And here is one of those places that it is available. And I love when people come to visit our office hours and reach out to us for help. So thank you for listening.
Hi, Joe. Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. We have a question and answer round, or just a discussion basically about what you've talked about. But George, you've got your hand raised, so we can just dive right into whatever your comment is on what Joe was talking about.
Oh, sorry, that was a misclick. Yeah, I know you're cool. I guess the area that I think is useful to expand on, I guess, would be the survey stuff. Like, what do you see as the most common pitfalls with group surveys?
Ooh, that's a great question. Oh, there's so many options to choose from. I think question wording is probably up there, that it is much harder to write a short, clear, unambiguous question than it seems. It's really easy to get a first draft of a question down, but we spend so much time workshopping the exact words that are used, making sure that it doesn't have any words in it that are really high reading level, depending on the types of participants that are involved and whether this is their first language or not. And making sure that it's not double-barreled, meaning you're kind of asking two things at once in one question, like, are you tall and smart? What do you say if you're short and smart? Can't just say yes to that. So less obvious than that example, but things like that come into play a lot. And then the other thing, because I can't just pick one, is really about the sampling method. So how you're finding the participants that you're talking to. A lot of the time it's convenience samples, the people that happen to be on our Facebook page as followers, or anything like that, where there's probably some bias coming into who's going to participate under those circumstances. If they are on your Facebook page, for instance, they're probably among your more interested audience members. And then if they agree to participate in a survey on top of that, even more so. So all of those things come into how you can interpret the results of the survey and can really change the interpretation.
Great, thank you. Sort of continuing on that theme, somebody has asked about surveys and respondents, how you get a sufficient big enough pool of respondents that are suitable. For my own dissertation some time ago, I wound up actually paying one of those survey companies for respondents, but I don't know, and assumed that they did the work of making them like as neutral as possible or whatever. But how do you do that? Do you use such services, or do you have another way?
We definitely do. So it depends whether what you're interested in is a general population sample. That's what we're talking about here with those companies. So if what you're interested in actually is people who follow your organization, then you can start from people that follow your organization in one way or another on social media or a website. But if you're talking about the general population, you want to know, in my country, how many people are vegan, for instance, or would support a bill to provide better animal welfare on farms. In that case, you probably will need to go with a panel company, a group that offers access to participants, because your ability to find a sample of random members of the population of your country is going to be pretty low. I don't know how I would even begin to approach that. So different companies have different levels of representativeness, because what you're talking about in those cases is how representative the different people that participate in your survey are of that general population. You want them to be as representative as possible. Most of the big ones are pretty good, and the external resources page on the Faunalytics site does list a few different panel providers if you're looking for specifics. But I think the question originally was about the number that are involved. So it depends, it always depends, but that answer is annoying. So I will say, if your goal is to get an estimate of the number of people in the population, or the percentage of people who do some particular thing or believe some particular thing, then you'll often see people getting about 1,000 participants for their sample. And the reason that that number is so common, apart from being a nice round number, is that it gives you approximately a plus or minus 3% margin of error. So the amount of variance that you would expect to see if you were to run the survey multiple times, you find that 40% of people would support that bill for farmed animal welfare. If you were to rerun that survey a bunch more times, you would expect that to bounce around a little bit. It wouldn't always be exactly 40%. It might go as high as 50% or as low as 30%. But the margin of error is what tells you how much it will bounce around. So 3% margin of error, if you're running it with about 1,000 people, is pretty good. If you don't have the budget for 1,000, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I think between 300 and 400 people gives you about a plus or minus 5%, which is also decent. So it depends on your purpose and how specific you need to be, and honestly what you have the budget for. But there's different options for finding that.
Great, thank you. The next question was originally for George. I think you can both you will both have something to say about it. But George, let's start with you. It's about reconciling being very methodical, doing the right thing step by step in order to make sure it's as good as it can be, with working under circumstances in which everything is urgent and you're in a rush and you need answers right away. Can you talk about how would you encourage organizations and campaigners to sort of really do the work beforehand, even though everything's urgent and everything needs to be today?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a common problem, particularly with like the policy window example I gave. Yeah, I think the place to start is, even if say that a decision needs to be made in 2 weeks, there is still research you can do in 2 weeks, or like reviewing, as Joe's saying, indicating like just try and review as much of the existing research other groups have done within that 2 week time frame. There's still stuff you can do if it's really urgent. You can just hope someone else has done something already in part. Or if there hasn't, there's still stuff you can do within 2 weeks to just reduce your uncertainty a bit. So although in a 2-week time frame, you're not going to be able to come to like a completely accurate conclusion about, say, what's the best thing. If say secondary legislation is coming up for review for pigs, you might not be able to work out what is the ideal thing to advocate for within that review. But in 2 weeks of research, you can definitely reduce your uncertainty compared to what you would be beforehand. So you could just put someone on it for 2 weeks to look into like the main welfare problems that are in your country. Maybe you don't have enough time to look at like what's practical for farmers to implement or like other considerations like that. You can definitely like reduce your uncertainty. Yeah, ideally, yeah, you've like mapped this out more in advance. You're aware this is coming up in like a year, and then you have plenty of time to like fully understand the issue and like prioritize correctly. But yeah, if it is urgent, like refer to other resources or do as much as you can in the time that's available to you. My suggestions.
Anything to add to that, Joe?
Not much, but yeah, I would just add, oftentimes things can feel overwhelming when you first start, and research is a really good example of that. So I think one of the first things you might want to do is reach out to someone who might have more expertise. So whether that's Animal Ask or Faunalytics or even just another group that's done similar work, they might be able to just point you in the right direction to get a lot more mileage out of your research quickly. If there is existing data, you know, if I ask George about prioritization, he's going to be able to point me to something much faster than I would be able to probably Google it myself. So.
There's another question about forming research hypotheses, what to look out for, how to make sure you've got it right before you sort of embark on what comes next. It's open to either of you. Which one of you wants to go first?
I can jump in. Okay. I didn't touch much on hypotheses in what I was talking about, but when I was talking about being neutral, that doesn't mean not having a hypothesis about what you're going to find or what you would like to find even. It just needs to be clear upfront that that is your hypothesis, and allow for another alternative hypothesis to be the actual answer. You need to bear in mind those alternative hypotheses when you're designing the research. But what makes a good hypothesis is similar to what makes a good research question, being short, succinct, clear. And in this case, this is where going from kind of conceptual level, what you think is going to happen, to really specific and measurable. So just saying that you think that people are going to be more influenced by a particular campaign, you think that they're going to be influenced to be more positive toward the ideas of farmed animal welfare, that is not a hypothesis at that point. That's still just sort of a fuzzy conceptual level thing. What you really want in order to actually do research is, what specifically am I going to see when I do this survey or look at the data on the number of people who sign a petition to make this change in regulations? You know, that you will see more people signing that petition when they have had this campaign material presented to them than people who have not, for instance. Really specific about what you're going to see and compared to what. Not just like we will see a large number of people signing it, but compared to what. There's always a comparison involved.
Sorry, I'm on mute. George, do you have anything you want to add to this question?
No, I think that's a good summary. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Here's a question that's specifically for Joe. It actually it relates to another question that's in there already. Any practical advice on how to best interpret and analyze data to prepare a succinct narrative? So the other question was similar, because we had a really good session yesterday or the day before on storytelling, and one of the questions I asked then was like, how do you resist the urge to present everything as like percentages and numbers and data, when apparently what the public wants is stories with beginnings and ends? Either of you can speak to that. The question was originally addressed to Joe, so we'll start there.
Absolutely. And I'm going to preface this by saying that researchers are almost terrible people to answer this question because we love the numbers so much. I think you'd probably get a better answer from our communications manager, who is really, her whole role is to turn the dry statistics into storytelling like that.
Which was actually another question. So you're just covering another one here. There you go.
But that being said, I will do my best in Jenna's absence. Simple data is best for one. So percentages, I've had to learn this lesson over and over again as a researcher at Faunalytics. I can do all of the regression analyses in the world and have betas and p-values and all of those things, but it's really hard to turn those into a nice story. So you should do the tests that you need to do, the analyses that you need to do in order to be confident in your results. But in terms of how you actually present it to the public, you probably want to look more at descriptive statistics, things like percentages of people who did X, Y, Z, and use those selectively, pulling out a few key pieces and using those to highlight the overall set of results that you have, which is a really tricky balance, I will say, between wanting to be transparent about the whole method and all of the results that you found versus just communicating a nice story. But there is a balance to be found there. And part of it is going back to the planning phase of your study. You can almost write the narrative before you even start, with the understanding that you might find out that it's not actually true. You need to remember that. Your results might not support it. But if you think about the whole story beforehand and you know what type of data then you would need to support what you're saying, then you can design your research in a way that will actually provide that right sort of data.
George, what about you?
Yeah, I guess we mostly encounter this in terms of our communication with other advocacy groups. And then the knowledge base they already have is like significantly higher than the public. And I think they're more amenable to being motivated by the numbers anyway, like researchers. So yeah, we've had less of an issue with that. Joe's mostly been the Faunalytics, mostly been the group I refer everyone to when they're talking about messaging. Like, talk to those guys, they know what they're doing.
We're over time, so I think I'll finish with just one further question. This one is for George. It's technical. If the sampling implementation is too small, I'm reading this word for word right now. If the sampling in implementation is too small by the end of the research deadline, should we adjust the sample size to ensure the representation? So I think in general, it's just about if your sample size is too small, what can you do? How do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of this in terms of what I was talking about. Is this something in terms of like the number of campaign opportunities considered? Is
Maybe
that the question?
Maybe so.
Okay. Yeah, because if that's been like too narrow earlier on and like you haven't expanded the scope initially, sometimes things just do fall through the cracks, and there's like less you can do at like the final stages to catch up. You can just kind of go back through and try and bring, like in our process, occasionally we'll say we identify like 200 campaign ideas for a group. By the end of the process, we might have identified like another 10 or 20, because you just like find things as you're going along. And all you can do then is just kind of bring them back through whatever process you were using at that stage and kind of like catch them up. Fortunately, there's like should be much less that you're kind of finding along the way. So it's like easier to do the research on like a small number of ideas quite quickly. Yeah, that's what we're speaking about. If it was about surveys, I think, yeah, Joe would be.
Well, let's ask Joe the same question, but in relation to surveys.
Okay. Yeah, so you run your survey with 100 people, then realize that maybe you should have had 500 people. It is, I'm just going to put this bluntly, it's sketchy to just add another 400 people once you've already done the first 100 based on what you've seen, because you're making the decision based on what you're seeing in the data probably. If you haven't looked at the data and you just realize, oh wait, it should have been 500 because of the margin of error we wanted, then adding them, as long as it's kind of right away, is not that big a deal. There's like gray areas. But looking at your data, saying this doesn't show what we wanted it to show, and then adding more people to see if it changes, is what we call p-hacking sometimes, or like researcher degrees of freedom. And you're essentially biasing your results by making the decision that way. So in a really ideal world, obviously, you want to make sure that you do a power analysis. That's what it's called, to figure out the sample size that you need. Talk to people to help you decide that sample size if you need to, and try not to do that. But if you absolutely have to, be transparent about kind of why you made that decision, how you're taking into account any bias that it might have added. And if you're talking about a long period of time between the two, then just don't do it. Just do the study again. I know that would be expensive, but there's problems with that.
Okay. I think that probably we should leave it at that, because we are over time. But I would like to remind anybody who's watching right now that I think you mentioned Faunalytics has some training materials available on the website, because I know all this can be really intimidating to people who don't live in this world, and even to people who do. People maybe need guidance on how to proceed and the importance of proceeding. So I would say check out the websites of Animal Ask and Faunalytics. And I want to thank you all for coming and for speaking today. Really fascinating and important stuff. I'm going to end this.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.